Picking up from the last video, we learned that labor has unique characteristics. And one of those characteristics is its non-pecuniary or non-monetary elements. When a person decides to take on a job, let's say I decide I want to be a biologist, okay, and I want to work in that research kind of field. Well, certainly the compensation in the form of wages and fringe benefits matters, but how much I love biology, how much I like working in a lab also matters. And so when you're thinking about the allocation of labor to a firm for production, well, there's a lot of factors that come into play beyond just the firm paying money to the worker. Another factor is the extent to which the firm treats its employees well. You could have two employers and one is attracting a lot more workers because even though everything else is the same, they're friendlier to their employees. They're more professional. So the non-monetary aspects matter as well. It also matters from the employer's standpoint. The employer, when they pay for labor, they're not just buying a machine that will pretty much do the same as every other machine. They're not getting a piece of land that's going to be similar to other pieces of land. What they're doing is they're getting a human being that's very different from all other human beings. And they have to consider those non-monetary elements. Do they like the worker? Do they want to go in on a daily basis and partner with this employee? So on and so forth. Labor is also unique in that there's a lot of institutional factors, that is, governmental factors that are involved. In order for labor to work in certain fields, they have to be licensed, minimum amount of training. Employers must pay a certain minimum wage, and workers aren't allowed to work below that. There's work hour standards. If you work over 40 hours a week, you have to get paid overtime. And there's various agencies, including OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Hazards Administration, that requires the work environment be safe for people. These are factors that don't typically show up with other resources, such as machinery, equipment, tools, raw land, or buildings. And so it's unique to the human resource because government is more protective of human beings. Or you could say we expect government to play that role of protecting workers in the workplace. There's also socioeconomic and political aspects to labor economics, and you'll see this throughout the course. This brings up a debate, and it also brings up some controversy. So be prepared because some of the things we talk about in this class may, have different views, and we have to think about different perspectives, whether we agree with them or not, so we can understand the debate that goes on. For example, there's a debate when we study labor economics about wage, income, and wealth inequality. Somebody that has a very high income might say, well, it's fair that I earn that income. I went to school, I work a lot of hours, I maybe started a business and took a risk. But other people might see that as unfair. They say, well, I didn't get the chance to go to school. I didn't have the opportunity you had. So this debate over wealth, wage, and income inequality is ongoing. Another aspect of labor economics is potential discrimination. There are laws that limit the amount of discrimination that a firm can engage in. So if you have a coffee shop, for example, and you say, I'm not going to hire people that are Christian, or I'm not going to hire people that are Muslim, well, that would be illegal. That is discrimination that is not allowed. However, if you have a coffee shop and you say, I'm not going to hire anybody that has no experience working in the customer service industry, that kind of discrimination would be allowed because it's pertinent to the job. So we need to look at discrimination laws and where discrimination might be appropriate and inappropriate. Legal and illegal immigration. Immigration is part of the supply side of labor. We have positive net immigration in this country, and as a result, there are more people coming here every year than leaving. Some of it is legal, some of it is illegal. However, those people are still part of the labor force and need to be analyzed. This is controversial because the effects of immigration are different based on your situation in the economy. So the debate really depends on, the side of the debate depends on who you talk to. We'll see, for example, that people that work in industries where they're not competing with the immigrants for jobs often benefit from immigration because those immigrants become a complement to what they do. I, as a teacher, for example, the immigrants that come here, they're not taking the jobs or competing with me for teaching jobs, but they are students, and that increases the productivity of my job if I have more students. On the other hand, if I were to work in the hospitality industry, especially here in San Diego, where I might have workers from across the border as competition for my job. So I might have a different perspective on immigration than somebody in a different profession. So we need to consider that debate. And in each of these instances, it's important to understand that the controversy is not going to be resolved. All our job is to do is understand the sides of the debate. But the science is going to be resolved, at least based on what we know to date. And so we'll be able to learn models to understand the effects on the economy of each of these things, but we'll also be able to then kind of back away from the science and say, okay, let's look at the debate. Let's see how people are responding to these contentious socioeconomic and political labor issues. Unionization is going to be talked about in this class, where labor comes together to create its own source of power for higher wages. And globalization, free trade, we'll discuss that. Some people are concerned, for example, that globalization has moved a lot of jobs over to other countries. Free trade has caused a lot of production to be done in other countries and eliminated job opportunities here. But on the other side of that, you have people saying, well, globalization has actually allowed people here to specialize and trade with other countries. We become more valuable because now we can make things not just for people in the U.S., but for people all over the world. It's also created lower prices for a lot of products that would otherwise be expensive. But globalization and free trade do have disparate effects on different people, and the debate is ongoing. Technology and unemployment, something that's been coming up for centuries. The idea that as we become more technologically advanced, some workers end up losing their job and find themselves structurally unemployed. Well, that is an issue, and it's a very microeconomic issue, because for the macroeconomy as a whole, at least in the U.S., the advances in technology have come with lower overall unemployment. But when it comes to specific industries, the impact of technology has been very different. For example, at one time, working as a cashier in a grocery store was a higher paying position that was likely full-time employment. But today, working as a cashier in a grocery store is a relatively low-paying job that sometimes is part-time employment at best. And this is in part a result of the advancements in mechanical or robotic cashiers that have become so ubiquitous now. So we'll talk about that, and we'll learn more about how unemployment is influenced by our technological advances. There's two ways to study labor economics. One way is descriptive, the other is analytical. We get a bit of both in this class, but let's detail it out first. Descriptive analysis is going to be looking at history. It's a non-analytical framework that helps us understand how labor markets have changed over time, and in many respects what that means for us today. You might study something like how wages and employment opportunities have increased in the past 30 years for people that have a college degree. So we will look at many descriptive parts of labor. We'll talk about the effects of the Great Depression and World War II, and the technological boom that occurred starting in the 80s and continues with us today, and see how that history has created the labor market we know of now. But we'll also use an analytical approach. And this is where we dominate in this class, because we can use the tools of micro and macro to understand labor markets. We can build models that not only tell us why things happened in the past, but also help us predict future outcomes. For example, the fact that wages have went up since World War II tells us what happened. It's a description of the past. That doesn't necessarily mean that wages will go up in the future. In order to make that prediction, we need models where we can start to see relationships and understand how things work. For example, we have a model that will show how higher education leads to higher wages. If we believe that higher education is going to be achieved in the future, then all else equal, we can predict that higher wages will be commensurate with that. The last thing I want to talk about in this introduction to the course is the kind of chapter layout for the book. We've got a course in labor economics. It breaks down into the macro elements in chapters micro elements in chapters 2 through 15, and the macro elements in 16 through 18. These are not mutually exclusive. I mean, we're going to look at some macro indicators in these chapters and some micro here. But the point is that it's generally bifurcated into micro and macro. You'll note that micro is the dominant part. What does that mean? Well, if you look at chapters 2 through 4, for example, we start our journey in this class looking at the supply side of the labor market. We look at things like the work-leisure decision for an individual, the decision of how much to work versus how much to not work. In chapter 3, we look at how that shows up in participation rates in the labor market. In chapter 4, we look at the quality of labor. Quality can be defined as experience and education. An hour of labor is not the same if it comes from a low-skilled worker versus a high-skilled educated worker. 2 through 4 give us the supply side of the labor market. In 5, we build the demand side. We put that together and we get the entire market. So you're starting to see the analytical framework here as we build models. So once we've built the labor market, we can then talk about some of its elements. In chapter 7, we'll learn about efficiency pay schemes. In chapter 8, we'll look at the wage structure. And in chapter 9, we'll look at mobility and migration. Then we shift over to 10 and 11, which will help us understand unions and collective bargaining. And then in chapter 14, we'll talk about discrimination. All of these give us nuances to the labor market. So chapters 7 through 14 help us better illuminate what's happening in these markets. We're going to skip chapter 12, and the reason there is because a lot of this governmental material is peppered throughout these other chapters sufficiently. I should say chapter 12, and we're also going to skip chapter 15, which is the job search. Then we get to the macro elements of the course, which include the distribution of personal earnings, chapter 16. That's where we'll look at some data on how income is distributed and how that shows up as inequality in the debate surrounding that. We'll look at productivity. One of the interesting things about labor that a lot of people don't know is labor, real wages are tied almost directly to increases in labor productivity. So understanding how we increase the productivity of labor is really another way of understanding how we grow our real wages. And then finally, in chapter 18, we'll look at the traditional employment and unemployment indicators you would study in a macro class. These are the headline indicators that the majority of people out there look at as their first kind of view of how the economy is doing. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a sense of what this class is about. We start our journey in the next video with chapter 2 and the supply side of the labor market.